The wind in the Canadian Arctic does not merely blow, it bites. It is a living thing that finds every gap in a wool coat and every seam in a leather boot. Captain Horatio Henry stood on the edge of the frozen coastline, watching the grey waves struggle against the encroaching ice of Terror Bay. It was 1859, and the world felt unfinished. The silence here is heavy. It is not the peaceful silence of a summer meadow, but the suffocating stillness of a graveyard. Every time the wind died down, Henry felt as though he were listening for something that had been lost 14 years ago. He was looking for the Erebus and the Terror. He was looking for Sir John Franklin and the 200 men who had vanished into this white void in 1845. To the Admiralty in London, this was a matter of national prestige and maritime science. To Henry, it had become something much more personal. He stared out at the jagged floes, seeing not just ice, but the ghosts of a failed empire. He remembered the reports of the ships being trapped, the desperate letters that never arrived, and the sudden, terrifying absence of any human trace. The Arctic does not give up its secrets easily. It swallows them. As the sun hovered low and pale on the horizon, Henry tightened his scarf. He was not here to merely observe the ice. He was here to drag the truth out from under it. Inside the HMS Resolute, the air was thick with the familiar, comforting sense of a working vessel. There was the sharp tang of salt spray, the heavy aroma of pine tar used to seal the seams, and the faint, smoky smell of the coal stove. It was a small comfort against the vast, cold emptiness outside the wooden hull. Henry sat in his cramped cabin, the light from a single oil lamp dancing across the pages of his journals. He was not reading his own logs tonight. Instead, he was obsessing over the reports from the 1854 search led by Captain McClintock. He traced his finger over the descriptions of the abandoned sledges and the scattered, useless supplies found near King William Island. The notes were grim. They spoke of a crew driven to madness by hunger and cold, a group of men forced to walk away from their ships into a wasteland of snow. The weight of the Admiralty's expectations pressed down on his shoulders like a physical burden. They wanted answers. They wanted to know if the ships had been crushed or if the men had simply walked into the white. Every man on this ship, from the youngest midshipman to the grizzled boatswain, knew the stakes. They were not just sailing for discovery. They were sailing into a legend of tragedy. Henry closed the logbook with a heavy thud. The time for reading was over. The time for searching had begun. The Resolute began to move, but it was not the smooth glide of a ship in open water. It was a slow, violent struggle. As the vessel pushed north toward King William Island, the ocean ceased to be liquid. It became a chaotic battlefield of frozen mountains. The sound was the worst part. It was a constant, rhythmic grinding. Huge plates of pack ice groaned against the wooden hull, sounding like the bones of a giant snapping in the dark. Every shudder of the ship sent a vibration through the floorboards, a reminder that only a few inches of oak stood between the crew and the crushing pressure of the Arctic Sea. Henry stood on the quarterdeck, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The light was dim and ethereal, a perpetual twilight that made depth perception nearly impossible. He gripped his sextant, trying to find a single point of reference in the shifting, pale sky. The navigation was a nightmare of guesswork and grit. Then, through the haze of spindrift and freezing fog, he saw them. Massive, towering ice floes rose up like the walls of a fortress. They were white, blinding, and indifferent to the tiny wooden ship attempting to pierce their ranks. The void had opened its gates, and the Resolute was stepping inside. The Resolute finally found purchase near a jagged stretch of shoreline. This was the place the searchers of 1848 had whispered about in their reports. It was a coast of nothingness. There were no trees, no birds, and no movement. Only the grey, pebbled beach and the endless, bruising sky. Henry stepped onto the land, his boots crunching on frost been cracked for decades. He felt a strange, heavy silence here. It was not the silence of peace, but the silence of an empty room. He ordered the men to begin scouring the shoreline. They moved in a thin line, their breath blooming in the freezing air like small, white ghosts. For hours, they found nothing but stones and salt. Then, a lookout shouted from a low ridge. Henry climbed the slope, his lungs burning from the cold. There, perched on a rise of dark rock, sat a stone cairn. It was small and slumped, looking more like a natural mound than a man-made structure. As Henry approached, he saw the stacked stones were weathered and lichen-covered. This was a marker. It was a signal left by men who knew they were not coming back. He reached out to touch the cold granite, and a sudden, chilling realization settled in his chest. The scale of the loss was not just in the numbers of the crew, but in the isolation of this place. These men had stood on this exact spot, looking out at the same indifferent horizon, realizing they were truly alone. The coast was not just a place of land and sea. It was a skeleton of a failed dream. The search moved from the shoreline into the frozen reaches of the permafrost. The ground was as hard as iron, a stubborn layer of earth that refused to yield to shovels or picks. Henry watched his men work, their faces etched with exhaustion. They were no longer looking for survivors. They were looking for ghosts. It was a grim sort of scavenging. A young sailor called out, his voice cracking in the wind. Henry hurried over to see a glint of metal protruding from the ice. They cleared away the frost to reveal a rusted tin of pemmican. The label was long gone, eaten by the salt and the years, but the shape was unmistakable. It was a piece of a ration, a tiny fragment of a meal meant to sustain a man through a winter that never ended. A few yards further, one of the men knelt by a patch of dark soil. He reached down and pulled something from the grit. He held it up for Henry to see. It was a silver spoon, its handle tarnished black, but its elegant shape still visible. It was a domestic object, something meant for a dining room in London, now discarded in the middle of a frozen wasteland. Seeing it made the tragedy feel intimate. This was not just a military disaster. It was the loss of men who had once sat at tables and held silver in their hands. Henry looked at the trail of debris. The artifacts were scattered, leading in a long, desperate line toward the south. They were mapping a path of slow, agonizing retreat. The time for observation had passed. Henry knew the window of weather was closing, and the coordinates they had gathered pointed to a specific, lonely stretch of ice. He gathered a small party, a handful of the strongest men, and began the march. The pace was frantic, driven by the fear that the Arctic would swallow their clues before they could reach them. The wind was a physical weight. It lashed against their wool coats and stung their eyes with fine, needle-like shards of ice. Every step was a battle against the shifting surface. The ice was not solid ground, but a moving, groaning puzzle of pressure ridges and sudden cracks. They were hunting for a magnetic anomaly, a point where the compasses had failed the men of 1845, but the landscape made it impossible to find a steady heading. Then, the sky simply vanished. A sudden, blinding blizzard descended without warning. The world turned into a swirling white void. Henry could not see his own hands. He felt the panic rising in his throat, a primal urge to run, but he forced himself to stay still. He gripped the lead rope, feeling the tension of the men behind him. They were blind, drifting in a sea of white, guided only by the memory of the direction they had been traveling. The wind howled like a wounded beast, and for a moment, Henry feared they would become just another set of traces lost to the permafrost. The blizzard finally broke, leaving a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. Henry wiped the frost from his eyelashes and looked down. The snow had shifted, carved by the wind into strange, low mounds. As he stepped closer, the white landscape gave way to something jagged and unnatural. They were not rocks. They were headstones. The small, weathered markers stood in a neat, grim row. They were primitive things, fashioned from local stone and lashed together with rusted iron. Henry knelt, his knees sinking into the frozen grit. He brushed away a layer of rime to find the carved letters. The names were faded, bitten by the salt and the frost, but they were legible. John Torrington, William Braine, Cornelius Hickey. These were the men who had died in the first year, 1845, before the ships had even been lost to the ice. A heavy stillness settled over the party. No one spoke. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Henry looked at the graves and realized these men had died in relatively good order. They had been buried with care, even as the Arctic winter closed in around them. There was no chaos here, only the quiet, terrifying dignity of a crew facing the end. He felt a sudden, sharp ache in his chest. These men had been waiting for a rescue that would never come. They had died in the shadow of the very ships that were supposed to carry them to glory. Now, they were just names in the ice, waiting for someone to find them and tell the world they had once been here. The search moved from the graves to the nearby debris of a makeshift camp. It was there, tucked beneath a heavy, frozen slab of slate, that Henry found it. It was a leather-bound journal, its cover cracked and stiff with age. The pages were swollen with moisture, but as he carefully turned them, the ink remained stubbornly dark. It was a fragment of a log, a final, desperate account of the months following the abandonment of the ships. As the men began to sift through the surrounding artifacts, a darker story emerged. Henry held a small, tarnished tin canister. He examined the contents, his eyes narrowing. The residue inside was unmistakable. Along with the scattered remains of canned food, there were traces of lead. The very tools meant to sustain them, the soldered tins of meat and vegetables, had become their slow, silent killers. The clarity of the evidence was heartbreaking. The journal spoke of a creeping lethargy, of minds clouding and bodies failing for no reason they could name. It was not just the cold or the hunger. It was a slow poisoning that had sapped their strength and their will. Henry sat on a crate, the journal heavy in his hands. He could almost see them, the men of the Franklin expedition, stumbling through the white void, their thoughts drifting away even as they fought to stay alive. The scientific mystery was solved, but the human cost was far more devastating than any chart or compass could ever convey. The transition from the white desert to the open sea felt like a fever breaking. The HMS Resolute groaned as she finally broke free from the crushing grip of the pack ice, her hull scarred but intact. As the dark, churning waters of the North Atlantic replaced the endless ice, a sense of relief washed over the crew. They were moving again. They were heading south. Yet, the mood on the deck remained somber. The usual boisterous songs and the clatter of work were muted. The men moved with a quiet, mechanical efficiency, their eyes often drifting toward the horizon. They had seen the graves. They had seen the evidence of the slow, metallic death that had claimed the men of 1845. The Arctic had given up its secrets, but the truth was a heavy burden to carry back to civilization. In the captain's cabin, Henry sat by a small lamp, surrounded by stacks of paper. He was preparing the scientific reports, documenting the lead traces and the contents of the journals. These papers would change everything. They would be read in the halls of the Admiralty and debated in the clubs of London. He thought of the men he had left behind on the ice, and he wondered if the truth would bring them peace, or if it would only serve to remind the world of how easily the frozen dark can swallow a man whole. The Resolute sailed on, a small, dark speck against the vast, indifferent sea. The warmth of London felt unnatural to Horatio Henry. In the heavy velvet air of the Royal Geographical Society, the smell of coal smoke and expensive tobacco replaced the sharp, metallic scent of salt and frost. He stood at the mahogany lectern, his hands steady despite the weight of the leather-bound journals resting before him. Outside, the city hummed with a life that felt frantic and loud, a stark contrast to the crushing, absolute silence of the Arctic Circle. He spoke clearly, laying out the evidence of the lead traces and the final, desperate movements of the Franklin crew. As he spoke, the room grew still. There were no debates about glory or the expansion of the empire tonight. There was only the quiet, heavy realization that the mystery was over. The disappearance of the HMS Erebus and the HMS Terror was no longer a ghost story whispered in the dark. It was a documented tragedy of hunger, cold, and failed iron. When he finally closed his notes, the applause was polite and subdued. He walked out into the cool evening air of London, feeling the strange disconnect between the civilized world and the wasteland he had left behind. He knew that while his reports would fill the archives, they could never truly capture the scale of that frozen void. The Arctic did not care about the Admiralty or the maps of men. It remained an indifferent, white expanse, holding its secrets in the permafrost. Henry looked up at the pale moon, wondering if the men he had found were finally at rest, or if they were still wandering through that endless, silent dark.